It started on one of those quiet, rainy afternoons where the house seemed to exhale with stillness. The holidays had brought everyone together, but in that moment, it was just me and Caleb. My husband, his father, was out running errands, and the rest of the family had scattered to their own activities. Caleb had come home from college a few days before, taller than I remembered, with a new confidence that seemed to fill the room whenever he walked in. I was in the kitchen, peeling apples for a pie when he wandered in. His presence had a way of making the air feel charged, though I couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was the way he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his eyes quietly observing as I worked. He had his father's sharp jawline but his mother's softer features, a combination that made him striking in an almost unsettling way. "Need help?" he asked, his voice smooth but casual, as though we'd done this 100 times before. "Sure," I replied, handing him a peeler. "But I'm not sure you remember how." He smirked. "I'm pretty sure it's like riding a bike." We worked side by side, the rain tapping gently against the window. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept drifting. There was something about the closeness, our elbows occasionally brushing, the quiet rhythm of our movements that felt intimate. Not in a way I could define, but enough to make me aware of every breath, every glance. "So how's school?" I asked, breaking the silence that had stretched just a little too long. "Good," he said, shrugging. "Busy, but good. I missed being home, though." He glanced at me then, his eyes lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. "I missed this." "This?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You know, being around family." His lips curved into a small smile, but there was a flicker of something else in his expression, something that made my stomach tighten. I told myself I was imagining things. Caleb had always been affectionate, always had a way of making people feel seen. It was part of what made him so likable. But as the hours slipped by, I found myself more aware of him than I'd ever been. The way he laughed, the way he moved, even the way his voice deepened when he spoke. All of it felt new, like I was seeing him through a lens I hadn't noticed before. Later that evening, after dinner, I found him in the living room, stretched out on the couch with a book. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the room. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I should join him or retreat upstairs. But before I could decide, he looked up and smiled. "Don't let me scare you off," he teased, patting the empty space beside him. I laughed, shaking my head. "You don't scare me, Caleb." I sat down, leaving a respectable distance between us. We talked for a while, about his classes, his plans for the summer, the little things that filled the gaps in our lives when we were apart. But as the conversation flowed, the space between us seemed to shrink. At some point, I realized I'd turned to face him fully, my legs tucked beneath me, my elbow resting on the back of the couch. "You're different," I said without thinking, my voice softer than I intended. "How so?" he asked, tilting his head. I hesitated. "I don't know. More grown up, I guess. Confident." He smiled, his gaze steady. "And you're the same. Beautiful, kind, always taking care of everyone." The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth rise to my cheeks. I laughed it off, trying to keep the moment light. But his expression didn't change. If anything, his eyes softened, and for a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath. I stood abruptly, smoothing my hands over my jeans. "I should check on the pie," I said, my voice a little too bright. Caleb didn't stop me, but as I walked away, I could feel his gaze on my back, heavy and unreadable. It lingered with me long after I'd left the room, a quiet reminder of something unspoken between us, something I wasn't sure I wanted to name. The days that followed were a delicate dance of avoidance and proximity. I found myself hyper-aware of Caleb's presence, each shared space charged with an unspoken tension. It was as if the air between us had thickened, every glance an accidental touch igniting a spark that neither of us acknowledged yet couldn't ignore. One evening, the family decided to watch a movie together. The living room was dimly lit, the flickering screen casting shadows that seemed to blur the lines of reality. I settled onto the couch, and Caleb chose the spot beside me, his thigh brushing against mine as he sat down. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, my pulse quickening in response. As the movie played, I became acutely aware of every movement he made, the way his arm rested on the back of the couch behind me, the subtle shift of his body closer to mine. My senses were heightened, each breath and heartbeat amplified in the quiet of the room. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, a magnetic pull that made it difficult to focus on anything else. At one point, he leaned in to whisper a comment about the film, his breath warm against my ear. The intimacy of the gesture sent a shiver down my spine, and I turned to respond, finding his face inches from mine. Our eyes locked, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. The space between us seemed to hum with electricity, a silent acknowledgement of the tension that had been building between us. I could see the conflict in his eyes, mirroring my own, a battle between desire and restraint, the pull of forbidden attraction warring with the boundaries we both knew we shouldn't cross. The air was thick with unspoken words, the weight of our proximity pressing down on us. Before either of us could act on the impulse that hung between us, I broke the gaze, turning my attention back to the screen. My heart pounded in my chest, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. I shifted slightly away from him, creating a physical distance that did little to quell the emotional turmoil within me. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, my mind racing with thoughts I dared not entertain. When the movie ended, I excused myself quickly, retreating to the sanctuary of my bedroom. Behind closed doors, I allowed myself to acknowledge the depth of the tension that had developed between us, the dangerous line we were towing. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind replaying the moments we had shared, the unspoken desires that lingered in the spaces between our words and actions. I knew we were treading on dangerous ground, the boundaries of our relationship blurring in ways that could lead to consequences neither of us were prepared to face. Yet despite the fear and guilt that gnawed at me, there was an undeniable thrill in the connection we shared, a magnetic pull that defied logic and reason. I was caught in a web of conflicting emotions, torn between the roles I was meant to play and the desires that simmered just beneath the surface. In the days that followed, I resolved to put distance between us, to reestablish the boundaries that had begun to crumble. But the tension remained, an undercurrent that flowed beneath the facade of normalcy, threatening to surface with each passing interaction. I found myself avoiding situations where we might be alone, seeking the safety of others' presence to keep the growing attraction at bay. Yet even in crowded rooms, I could feel his eyes on me, a silent reminder of the connection we both were struggling to suppress. The internal battle was relentless, each day a test of willpower and restraint. I knew the path we were on could lead to heartache and regret, yet the allure of the forbidden was a powerful force, one that left me questioning my own strength to resist. As the tension between us continued to build, I couldn't help but wonder how long we could maintain the facade, how long we could deny the desires that threatened to consume us both. The line between right and wrong had become a blur, and I was left navigating a labyrinth of emotions, each turn leading me deeper into uncharted territory. The next morning, I woke early, hoping the crisp dawn light might clear my head. I made my way downstairs, expecting the solitude of an empty kitchen. But there he was, leaning against the counter with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The sunlight filtered through the window, casting a golden glow over his features, and for a moment I felt my resolve weaken. "Morning," he said, his voice softer than usual, as though aware of the storm that had been brewing inside me. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone even as I busied myself with the coffee maker. I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his presence making the air feel too thick. Every nerve in my body was on edge, every movement calculated to keep the fragile distance between us intact. But Caleb wasn't one to let silence linger. "We need to talk," he said finally, his words landing like a challenge. I froze for a moment, then turned to face him. "About what?" "You know what." His eyes searched mine, and I hated how easily he could strip away my defenses. "This. Whatever's been happening between us." "There's nothing happening," I said quickly, too quickly, my voice betraying me. He stepped closer, closing the gap between us with a quiet determination that made my heart race. "Stop pretending," he said, his voice low but firm. "We both feel it." "Caleb," my voice cracked, and I took a step back, but the counter stopped me. He was too close now, his scent, clean, familiar, intoxicating, invading my senses. I could feel the heat of his body, the tension radiating from him as his hands braced on the counter on either side of me. "This is wrong," I whispered, but the words felt weak, hollow, even to my own ears. My hands gripped the edge of the counter, as though it were the only thing keeping me tethered to reason. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but that doesn't make it go away." His eyes held mine, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. Every ounce of logic, every rule I had built my life around felt as fragile as glass. The space between us was electric, a current that pulled us closer even as my mind screamed for me to push him away. "I can't do this," I said, though my voice wavered. "You're my—" "Don't say it," he interrupted, his tone laced with something between desperation and defiance. "Don't put a label on this, and it's not that simple." His words hung in the air, a challenge I wasn't sure I was strong enough to face. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the internal battle raging within me. I wanted to run, to escape the intensity of the moment, but I couldn't move. His gaze held me captive, his presence overwhelming in a way I couldn't describe. "Caleb, please." My voice broke, and I hated the vulnerability that crept into it. "We can't." For a moment I thought he might step back, might give me the space I so desperately needed. But instead he lifted a hand, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, and it sent a shiver through me. "I know," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean I don't want to." The honesty in his voice, the raw vulnerability in his eyes, was my undoing. My resolve crumbled, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like to give in, to cross the line we had been dancing around for days. But just as quickly as the thought came, reality came crashing back. I pushed past him, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps as I put as much distance as I could between us. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the sink, trying to steady myself. "We can't," I said again, my voice firmer this time. "It doesn't matter what we feel. It's wrong." I heard him exhale sharply, a sound of frustration, of resignation. When I finally turned to face him, the conflict in his eyes mirrored my own. He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Please, Caleb," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't make this harder than it already is." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly, his tone laced with a sadness that cut deeper than I expected. "I'll stop, but that doesn't mean it'll go away." With that, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the echoes of what almost happened. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, a reminder of how close we had come to crossing a line we could never uncross. I sank into a chair, my heart heavy with the knowledge that the tension between us wasn't gone, only buried. For now. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to our channel for more real and true stories like this.